Hello and welcome. This is Thomas Kevin Dolan. I am the author and writer of Little Fag, A Journey of Self-Acceptance and Healing. And today I will read from Chapter 10, Light Has the Power to Heal, begins on page 264 of my memoir. But somehow, the light found its way in. I questioned every thought, challenged every motive. I held myself accountable even when it was hard. I would lie to myself and then call myself out on the lie. And slowly, so painfully slowly, I found the courage to face myself. I finally stopped resisting and surrendered. What I braved. I remember my 4th day in future-focused leadership training with the Ford Institute in San Diego. Think of it as a boot camp for leadership wannabes. I'd spent the previous 4 years preparing to hear all this leadership wisdom. I think my 93 classmates had as well. Why was I suddenly feeling 9 years old and having the desire to bolt, run away, or simply slip out the side door and disappear? I felt scared. And I really did not want to be there. Nothing anyone was saying that day made a lot of sense. What was happening? I don't know about you, but I've spent years and thousands of dollars identifying many of my triggers, many of the things that actually activate me. Those moments when people or circumstances right in front of my eyes suddenly represent something from my past, and I disappear or react in completely inappropriate fashion, as quickly as I can utter, "Breathe, Thomas, I'm gone." This occasion was different somehow. Something niggled at me and I sensed it just wanted to be acknowledged. In the midst of trying to figure all this out, I got to laugh at myself thinking, sure, you can hold dozens of coaching clients right where they need to be, but I'd fire your butt as my coach because right now you haven't a clue. There seemed to be something under the desire to leave the room, some other feeling I'd never noticed before. My curiosity as an integrated coach had the best of me. So I breathed. Leaving, running away, disappearing, and bolting are not feelings. These are thoughts. In the room for 3 days previous, all I heard was, "You are a passionate leader." Yet when I hadn't noticed was a quieter voice that said, "No, you're not." This was the energy. It was resistance to allowing myself to claim I was a leader. I immediately thought of the Borg on Star Trek and heard these words from its leaders: "Resistance is futile, you will be assimilated." My family taught me my resistance. They were masters at resistance, as was I. Instead of managing this old thought on my own, I turned to a classmate, one of my leadership partners, and said, "I'm feeling resistance." My classmate asked how she could support me. From a place I don't think I've ever come before, I heard myself ask, "Please help me stay in the room." I made 3 agreements with myself to stay in the room. One was to stay until the lunch break. The second was to come back after lunch. The third was to listen to the afternoon session, which, interesting enough, was titled, "Why Are You Here?" That day, I did not bolt, run away, or disappear. Instead, I reacquainted myself with an old friend, resistance. It kept me safe, growing up with my family, and provided me with a quick way out of dangerous circumstances. But I realized, as an adult, resistance wasn't serving me. Resistance lies under fear and shows up as a way to protect me, an old way, mind you. But on this day, I had it, and it did not have me. What I braved that weekend was not deferring to my familiar pattern and allowing it to run my life. The gift I received that weekend was graduating as a passionate leader. The unlearning. Mom was the poster child for unwellness. Not that she spent a lot of time in her life being unwell, but she spent all of her life using her maladies as a way to get love and attention. 7 days after taking a flight from Honolulu back to Vancouver, where my return was predicated on getting some medical help, my pharmacist said to me, "People like you who acquire that kind of bacterial infection, we usually don't get to speak with." Puzzled, yet wanting to feign some degree of humor tucked within the question, I replied, "You don't usually get to talk to them?" It was Halloween 2010, and the last few days had been very uncomfortable for me. As my eyes opened on a sun-drenched morning in Honolulu, I heard this very clear whisper. Its directive was simple and to the point. Go home. I remember resisting the whisper and choosing to stay put. I'd been on a whirlwind travel schedule, supporting a friend playing volleyball in Las Vegas, and committing to seeing as many circus performances within my short stay there as possible. This was my first trip to Vegas. My only wish would have been to have what went on in Vegas stay in Vegas. And after my Vegas trip, I journeyed to Honolulu. As I disembarked my Honolulu flight, a flight attendant said, "That looks like a nasty bug bite in your hand. Be careful with that." I thanked him for his unsolicited medical opinion, wished him a gentle aloha, and stepped off the plane to the moisture of the Hawaiian air. The undiagnosed bug bite, although it just looked like a scratch, first showed up in Vegas. I thought nothing of it and continued my foray into the Vegas energy. The scratch became a bit itchy, so, of course, I rubbed it. That, I would be told, was not a good thing to do. The scratch, in the midst of the amazing energy of Honolulu and being with many new friends, was beginning to become redder. Plus, I noticed it beginning to swell. It was a bit uncomfortable, but this was Halloween, and I was not going to miss any of the festivities. Later that night, prior to walking through downtown Honolulu to see all the costumes, I decided to apply ice to the now bright red and elevated bump on my hand. It seemed to ease the pain. Discomfort quickly shifted to extreme pain. Although I wanted to panic, I suddenly noticed a gentle presence around and within me that conveyed a sense of peace. It was familiar, like the comfort of something that had been with me for a long time. I also noticed a desire to draw attention to this bump as a way to get attention from my friends. For some odd reason, I didn't do that. After contending with the throngs of Halloween revelers, finishing some yummy dessert at a local cafe, my future husband looked my way and said to the group, "It's time for us to leave." He noticed I was in trouble. Although the pain was excruciating, the swelling now resembled the costumed hand of Mickey Mouse. There was still this presence that invited me to breathe and conveyed that I was okay. I appreciated the intention from my partner, but being aware of how Mom used sickness to get love, I tended not to want to draw too much attention to how I was feeling. Suddenly, I remembered the whisper I heard to go home. I immediately turned to my partner and asked him to contact the airline and get me on the next flight to Vancouver. Early that afternoon, I settled into the longest 6 hours of flying in my life. I was met by my dearest friend at Vancouver Airport and quickly whisked to the emergency at a local Vancouver hospital. The haze of the trip, the pain, the fear, and the confusion were rapidly disappearing. Morphine does that. What did not leave me was the presence, inviting me to know I was okay. I would spend the next 4 days on intravenous antibiotics, morphine, and a host of other pharmaceutical goodies, all intended to chase down an MRSA. It's a type of bacteria that is resistant to several antibiotics. It is also known as a superbug. I remember the comment my pharmacist shared. People like you who acquire that type of bacterial infection, we usually don't get to speak with. What he meant was that they usually die. The attending physician at the emergency ward shared that I would have been in a lot of trouble if I'd waited one more day. By acknowledging the presence and listening to the whisper, I helped to save my life. For me, the whisper is the voice of the divine, the universe, or my intuition, or God. The unlearning for me was making sure I didn't want to turn this challenge into some ploy to get love. The presence is alive within me, and each time I listen to the whisper, I honor the grandest and greatest version of myself. That was a really scary time. Really scary time. I still remember the desperation, right, my now husband had to get me to an emergency ward here in Honolulu. And there were two reasons I didn't want to go. One was, although I didn't know the medical system at that time, one was not trusting it. And the other, of course, was the notion of how expensive I'd heard medical care was in the US. And eventually I would ask what the physicians in Vancouver thought an emergency visit in the US might have been. And I think they ventured, for what I went through and the time they spent, and they probably said anywhere from kind of $30,000 to $45,000 US. So I'm really proud to have not panicked. I'm really proud that I'd listened to that whisper, didn't do the emergency ward here in Honolulu, and instead got my butt on the next flight I possibly could get on, the quickest one I could possibly get on. And the bigger learning in all of this was to, and this would make sense because of course I lived most of my life in fear, didn't listen to any sense of wisdom or learning that was available to me because I was too scared. But in this case, although I had a teacher, right, mom, that would use unwellness to get love, I didn't make those choices, which I thought was pretty cool. So kudos to me. But more importantly, I was willing, trusting to breathe, kind of stay where I was, not to panic. And then eventually when I got to a point where it was more severe, and I do remember, hand kind of softball size now, I remember the infection starting to travel up my arm, and I knew it was time to go. So the timing was impeccable, although some would say you may not want to challenge yourself again by leaving something that long. And now that I know that, I would be much quicker to get medical attention. And yet, remember, the dynamic was, I'm living in Canada at the time, I have no medical insurance here in the United States. So there were a bunch of things at play. And I allowed them to be at play, but not panicky, which was pretty cool. So I'm grateful to my husband for gently holding me. When we reflect back on that, I would ask him, how was that for you? And he said it just was really scary for him. Right? He wanted me to go to the emergency ward. And I gently said no. So, I can only imagine what that would be like if the roles were reversed, where he was in trouble at some level and I'd made a suggestion to get some medical help and he'd said no. So lots of things at play, but most importantly, by being able to breathe, trust that whisper that I was okay, and ultimately be with the fear, be brave enough to know that I didn't have to panic, and ultimately get myself to a place of realizing that I'm okay, getting myself back to Canada, and getting the amazing treatment that I did. And then going back to that pharmacist, a couple of weeks after all of it settled, and thanking him for the comment, because he would distinguish between a recommendation that a physician was making in terms of, I think it was probably another antibiotic, but this time pill, not intravenous. And he was the one to say, I actually don't think this one will work for you because I think I have an allergic reaction to some form of penicillin. And that was the form that they were going to give me. And he just said that wouldn't have worked. So when I told him and reflected back to him the comment, right, we don't get to see these people again. And he sheepishly looked up at me and said, I couldn't in my role as a pharmacist say, because while you were healing from this, I didn't want to say that most people die. He said, but I wanted with gratitude to be able to say to you, I'm so glad that I got a chance to talk to you. Because, as I shared, other folks that bumped into this, he wasn't able to have a conversation with them afterwards. So everything happens for me and not to me.